he wrote, "Once we dominate Europe, Asia Pacific and Africa, if US standards..." So this is about them trying to become a world leader in software standards, okay? "If US standards don't match ours and we can't enter the US, then the US can't enter our territory." So there's two really...
It's quite menacing.
Really dodgy bits in that. The use of the word dominate, obviously, is really dodgy. But then the use of the word our, that possessive.
Yeah.
So basically, they want to dominate in order to own it. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We're actually not having a beer this week for a variety of reasons. Ian's got to do a proper call at 4 with presumably someone in the States.
Yeah. West Coast. Me and Pierre were separately out and had a few pints last night. Just feeling a little bit delicate. We will be going out later, but I've got some stuff to do. I've got to drive into London on Saturday, so I don't want to be minging when I do that. So we'll see. We'll see how sensible I am at 11 o'clock tonight. But we're not having beer on the pod, so yeah, just a glass of water. How about that? My body's a temple, as you know. So yeah, and it's a nice day. We're going to go and hopefully sit at the Anchor, which is right on the Thames. Is that one next to the Tate Modern?
It's that one a bit further on. That's the Founders. It's that one where we sat, where we got turfed out by some
right, the
bobbies.
one that you can never get into because...
That's right, well, I booked it. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Except I bet they stuck us inside. That would just be typical, wouldn't it?
Well, it might not be that good, though, the weather, when we get there.
Oh, right. Anyway, and we shouldn't faff too much because of your thing, we've got to crack on. Pierre.
Yes.
Did you want to talk about who's been watching the pod?
Yes. As I mentioned last week, still in the lead, it's Denver, Colorado.
Denver again.
Yeah. And London, a close second.
But thanks, Denver. Yeah. You're a cool city. I've actually been there. My dad lived there for a little bit. Well, it's more Boulder. I went to Boulder, and that was good fun. And
I've been to Boulder.
Yeah.
I've been hiking around Boulder.
Yeah, well, it's beautiful around Colorado, isn't it?
For a light reading event, actually. Well, I didn't go hiking for a light reading event. But
let's plug the event, which is returning to Denver at the end of August.
Which is the Big Fest.
Big 5G event.
There we are. So, yes.
See you there.
Yes, Colorado fans. You know, one of us might even turn up there, and then you can be groupies.
You have to turn up, Scott.
As long as there's no quarantine.
Do you know what? The groupies are a pest, but I'd miss them if they went away. No, of course we have no groupies. Okay. Pierre, before we move on, you got busted.
I did.
On the way down. So Pierre's got this, as if he's not cool enough being French in the first place. He's got this big powered skateboard.
Yeah.
And you sort of steer it like a normal skateboard, but you power it with a wireless thing in your hand, don't you?
Yeah.
And you've been using it for years. Every time we come in, you've always taken that in.
I've had one for like 5 years now.
Yeah, and you've always taken it into the office.
Yeah.
Turns out it's illegal.
Fucking illegal.
So tell us what happened. You got stopped by the cops.
I was nearly here. Honestly, I was.
Oh my God.
Of my journey, I was at 95%. I had just 5% left, and the in the bike lane, this cop just basically put his hand forward and said, "Stop!" And I thought, okay, maybe I did something wrong, like ate the light or something. And then slowly but surely, he basically fined me £300.
Wow.
And took my skateboard away.
And took your skateboard away, and they want you to front up another ton 50 to get the skateboard back.
Yeah. So at this point, I was like, "You can have it. Don't worry."
That's so gutting.
And then
and you didn't know it was illegal. It wasn't like you were so cool that you were just doing illegal stuff.
And the scooters are everywhere, and they're also illegal apparently.
Right. So it feels to me like a shakedown. It's just selective. This illegality, this technical illegality is happening all the time, and every now and then, if a copper wants to hit his numbers, he'll come and bust someone.
And as he was finding me, we saw a guy on a scooter just go past, and they couldn't stop.
On the pavement?
Yeah, on the pavement as well. I don't do that. That's dangerous.
Right. Yeah, so if anything, if you're being a danger to anyone, it's to yourself.
Yeah.
You're sitting there
just
going
like a
alongside
bicycle.
trucks and cars on a glorified skateboard. If anyone's going to come a cropper, it's you, isn't it?
I'm just like a bicycle.
Yeah.
That's bullshit.
It is massive bullshit. And the reason it's not a bicycle is because it's powered, basically.
Yeah.
Or would you get busted if you'd actually had a skateboard?
No, that's fine. Yeah.
So
and semi-electric bike, as long as you have pedals, it's fine.
It's
but that's
so
even
arbitrary.
more dangerous.
It's utterly arbitrary, and I'm annoyed for you, mate.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right.
We should be on Top Gear. Talking about this sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
How disgraceful it is that people get punished for
Clarkson
using motorised.
Clarkson heard about this, he wouldn't be happy, I don't think.
He hates cyclists.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know what he thinks of electric skateboard riders.
I don't either.
Might not be a fan.
No, he likes just pricey cars that he can sit in. Okay, so let's crack on. What are we going to... Oh, yes, and just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site, I think I forgot last week, didn't I? If you're watching it on the site, you can see it on YouTube and Facebook, and you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. We're going to start, for a change, by talking about Huawei.
It's not been the first item for a while, though, has it? Huawei?
No, it probably hasn't. And, it's not necessarily earth-shattering news. It's more... In fact, this is a bit of a sort of common thread in what we're talking about. It's more a sort of communications, a sort of public image, public perception thing. And they come out with... Well, they didn't come out with it. They had some chat about how they're pivoting to software and what that means. And they kind of arsed up the communication as far as I'm concerned. And we both covered that. Then we're going to talk about my bugbear of censorship. There have been a few things going on. There have been national governments trying to crack down on social media platforms, but then there's social media platforms ramping up their own censorship just because they fancy it. And there's so many contradictions and idiocy going on in there that I'm bursting. It's got to come out.
Yep.
So we'll chat about that, and then we're going to finish off talking about another perennial, OpenRAN. Mm-hmm. But specifically, you wrote about how the UK regulator is trying to poke its nose in.
Yeah, I mean, I think other regulators are as well.
Right.
But
Okay.
I did specifically write about Ofcom. Yeah.
Okay. Fine. And we'll decide whether or not we think that's a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right. So yeah, the Huawei thing. So basically, it was originally a Reuters story. In fact, I'm gonna do my thing of actually firing it up here so that I know what I'm talking about. There was a Reuters report on a leaked internal memo sent by Ren I think Shengfei is how you pronounce it.
Ren the founder.
Wei taught me once how I pronounce it, and it's Shengfei, I think.
We'll just call him Ren.
I don't think Wei watched it, but if you do, Wei.
Ren's easy to pronounce.
In fact, you know what?
He goes by Ren quite a lot.
He does go by Ren.
He goes away. Okay, well then forget his surname. Who cares? On that note, though, you know, it's sort of getting spicy with China, and I'd love to, when people are allowed to travel again, I'd love it if Wei came in and we had a China special. Because I'm just aware of the fact, and this will come up in the second segment as well. Aware of the fact that it's easy to make generalisations about the country, but obviously, as I said on one comment in the forums, it's absolutely vital to separate the people themselves from their political representative, especially when they don't.
We saw that in the Middle East a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's completely unfair to generalise about Chinese people. And I have no knowledge.
No, when we say China, I think a lot of the time we mean
we're
Chinese
talking about
government.
it politically. We're talking about Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I sent you this John Cena video.
All the
week.
Chinese.
No, there's one. So there's one we can mention. It's a bit of a tangent. So John Cena, who's like this former Marine, and was he a wrestler as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
WWE.
Yeah. And he's sort of supersized like The Rock or
not quite
something
big,
like that.
Yeah. Get on for that.
And he's in the latest Fast and Furious movie, which I think is 9.
Yeah.
And apparently they just fucking love him over in China, those ones.
Yeah.
Because he speaks like passable Mandarin.
Yeah. Well, this is coming up to his thing, and he did some interview in China, I think, or maybe it was in Taiwan. Anyway, and all he said was, it's going to be great. This is one of the first countries to see it, or something like that.
Taiwan will be the first country
to see it.
Yeah.
And then obviously China, that's got a real stick up its arse. Political China, I stress. Got a real stick up its arse about Taiwan, about it basically being part of Greater China and not being a country, while everyone else is like, "Wow, it looks a lot like a country to me, mate."
Yeah.
And you get all this stuff like you had the WHO. You remember a year ago that bloke having a flap about not wanting to mention anyone who wants money from China or favour from China.
What they could do is they could always ask the Taiwanese people what they think. That'd be an interesting novelty, wouldn't it?
I suspect they think they're a country.
Chinese.
Tom Cruise in the original Top Gun has a Taiwanese flag on his jacket. And in the remake, the sequel,
they had to airbrush it.
They had to they had to remove it fully.
Why don't they ask the Chinese what they think about Xi Jinping? That'd be an interesting innovation as well.
Yeah, well, there we are. Ask the People's Daily for an objective critique of his premiership. And yes, and so John Cena, he said country, and obviously in the back channels, China, representatives of China will have moaned and gone, basically, fucking wind your neck in, or it's not getting released in China.
I think it's mostly studio execs from...
Is that what you think's happened?
America.
Well, that would be my guess. I think there is, again, I'm going to generalise here, having said how bad it is, but I think the way China operates right now is quite transactional.
Yeah.
And, you know, China's got a lot of money. It's got a massive market. As we know in the telecoms, it's got by far the biggest telecoms market. And it exerts pressure. You know, this is where you get the real culture clash. It exerts pressure on US companies such as film studios who want to tap that market. The difference is that the US, even though like Donald Trump tried it a fair bit, US can't go, if you piss me off, you can't access our market. Yeah, they've kind of done that with Huawei, but on the whole, that's an exception. Whereas China can, because it's much more centrally controlled.
Yeah.
And so anyway, cut long story short, John Cena did this grovelling apology in Mandarin. Just basically, I'm really sorry, please don't hate me.
But also, I think I had to watch it again. I don't think he actually says he's sorry. I think he says repeatedly, I love China and its people. So he doesn't...
Right.
Because he also wants to be cool with Taiwan at the same time. So he doesn't want to...
I don't know.
You know, he doesn't say, I'm sorry, I'll take that back. Taiwan is not a country. Taiwan
he doesn't
is China.
say that.
He doesn't
right.
say
So it's more placating than
probably
apologising.
quite carefully worded.
Right,
Yeah,
fair enough.
he was quite clever at saying, you know, I really love China and its people.
Yeah. It's like, well, no one doubts that. You just call Taiwan... the two things are possible. You can call Taiwan a country and also like China.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Huawei.
Yes. So, you know, so there's a bit of that going on. And, you know, in this sort of transactional throwing your weight around spirit, there was this Reuters report on a internal memo sent by RAN to the whole company, covering their strategic pivot to software, which, you know, we've spoken about before, and that's a known thing.
Yeah.
And it's come from a place, you know, while we might criticise China, I still think the unilateral US activity to basically try and destroy the company is excessive. We still to see any public hard evidence that they present a security threat now.
Yeah.
There are other Chinese companies that are allowed to operate in places like the UK and the US. You know, whereas if the assumption is that every single Chinese company is basically going and is in league with the Chinese military or the Chinese government, then why are we allowing any Chinese companies at all anywhere? So it feels like they've picked a champion. They've picked a sort of a company to sacrifice to sort of say, China, get back in your box because we can just swap one of your biggest companies whenever we want.
Yeah, and I think its role in critical infrastructure, obviously. Yeah. I mean, we're less bothered about Chinese clothes makers, aren't we, than, you know...
Well, my big one's always Lenovo.
My big
one's always Lenovo, one of the biggest PC and server companies in the world.
Well, I think that's one that's fallen under the radar a bit, you know, and I know some... analysts sort of say, well, if you're going to sort of pick on Huawei, then Lenovo is just as much of a concern.
And yet they're not, which makes it feel arbitrary.
Yeah, and also phones, actually. I mean, it's often been focused on network equipment rather than devices, but I see no reason why handsets aren't potentially even more of a concern.
And yet Xiaomi just won its legal defense in the US.
I thought was interesting, but yeah, it has been singled out. It and ZTE, although, I mean, there's the real contradiction at the moment, is that ZTE all of a sudden is not on the entity list and doing very well. And thank you very much, actually. Had the best quarter of all the vendors.
Right, in terms of like year-on-year growth.
Up a fifth.
Yeah.
And most of that's network as well, because it's not as heavily reliant on its handset business or enterprise. So,
its handset business is
so it can buy from TSMC, it can buy from the American companies that it dealt with before it got sort of put on the blacklist and then taken off. So, but that's a real contradiction, because the whole reason for this Huawei being on there is that it's a security threat. Well, if it's a security threat, why isn't the smaller vendor that has closer links to the Chinese state a security threat?
Exactly. It's incoherent. And this isn't to say that I know for a fact they're not a security threat. I mean, it will be. It just hasn't been any evidence presented, strong evidence presented one way or the other. Anyway, so we sympathise with Huawei being put in this position as a sort of pawn of politicians dicking about with each other. But I just don't think this latest thing makes me think that I think it's actively harming itself increasingly in its response to it. So in the Reuters thing, they had a quote from this memo that Ren sent. I'm going to read out the quote from the Reuters thing. It says, he wrote, "Once we dominate Europe, Asia Pacific and Africa, if US standards," so this is about them trying to become a world leader in software standards, okay? "If US standards don't match ours and we can't enter the US, then the US can't enter our territory." So there's two really...
It's quite menacing.
Really dodgy bits in that. The use of the word dominate, obviously, is really dodgy. But then the use of the word our, that possessive.
Yeah.
So basically, they want to dominate in order to own it. Mm-hmm. And, as I wrote later on, I said, there are so many presumptions built into that statement, it'd be easy to dismiss it as the ravings of a megalomaniac if it didn't coincide so closely with the broader Chinese Belt and Road strategy. Mm-hmm. Now, the stated Belt and Road strategy, this is known, has been around for ages, is just for China to more economically integrate itself into the rest of the world, and just create, the Belt and Road is in reference to like the Silk Road of sort of medieval times. But in practice, it's easy to believe that what China's trying to do is create client states.
Yeah.
It is, its strategy is very transactional. Like there was that thing of where they invested loads of money in a Sri Lankan port and then they couldn't pay it back and they went, all right, we're fucking having the port then.
Yeah, it's pretty much their African strategy.
Yeah, quite. And there was another thing, I didn't mean to bring it up, but briefly, they had a sort of a bit of a setback in Ethiopia because there was a big, they basically opened up the Ethiopian market and there were two big consortiums bidding it sounds like to be almost like a monopolist, or certainly the dominant player.
The telecom player, yeah.
Yeah, and it turned out one of them was backed by the Yanks and the other one was backed by the Chinese.
Robert Clark, one of our friends, wrote a very good piece about how Africa is now becoming a sort of battleground almost between the West and a proxy war between America and China, because they don't want, and Huawei's a big player in this because it's got a really powerful position in Africa, apparently. I think 70% of networks are built by Huawei.
And not many African countries give a toss whether America tells them to not have Huawei.
They don't listen. They don't want to listen to America in particular. So they're not going to sort of bow down like the Europeans have done and kind of take instruction.
No, so it's viewed as a sort of real greenfield site for this geopolitical arm wrestle. And then there was the consortium that included Vodafone, Safaricom, some other people won, and that was the one that was backed by a US fund. Yeah. And the Wall Street Journal had a piece that claimed that a condition of this funding from the US is that none of it is spent on Huawei gear, or ZTE probably, but I think it's Huawei specifically. Yeah. So that's what's going on there, and. So yes, if we give a less charitable interpretation of Belt and Road, it's this economic imperialism. It's creating client states in places like Africa, and that statement I just read out from Ren seemed to really, you're talking about dominating in our territory and all that, seemed to say that. Anyway, I'm gonna hand it over to you because we both covered the same thing and we could both tell the same story, but I don't want to just do it all.
Yeah.
But you covered it, and there was an added complication to the sourcing of this internal memo, wasn't there?
Yeah, well, we saw a different version of the memo where that language, that exact quote had really been softened. I can't remember the exact phrasing now. You probably got it near the quote that you just quoted from Reuters. But the stuff about dominate had been taken out. I think it was about sort of gaining a foothold.
Yes.
It was much more conciliatory. And,
totally.
And there was nothing. There wasn't a reference to our, I don't think, and there wasn't a reference to keeping them out of China. I think it was more about they won't be able to come into. It was much softer, anyway,
and it was more language. In keeping with the more standard official line, which is that I think they call it decoupling, and we call it balkanization. But basically, splitting the world into the sort of Chinese tech ecosystem, and the US tech ecosystem is bad.
Yeah,
which it is.
Which is going to happen. I mean, this whole software pivot, which they sort of announced, I think, a bit earlier, around about the time they published their annual results.
That's
they
right,
kind of said this big push on software, which to me seems like it's, a lot of it's actually about coming away from their kind of core telecom sector and, stuff they've done really well, making boxes and all the stuff that Huawei's done very well for the last, 20 years, whatever it is. Very hardware reliant industry, obviously, and something that the US has been able to kind of jimmy by imposing trade sanctions, because so much of the underlying technology, as we know, is dependent on US designs and US machinery. So
intellectual property.
Whereas I think they've thought software is, the only barriers really to them doing well in software is the pool of talent, what you can hire, and there was some really I thought there was some really interesting sort of almost equally sinister stuff in the version we saw, actually, about sort of teaming up with the Russians and
right.
and countries where they have great sort of whizzes in maths and physics, because we can make use of that to create this kind of common front. So you've got this sort of Huawei plus Russia joining. I mean, look, if the US was scared by Huawei going around and selling telecom boxes that they think might be sort of slightly dubious, then the prospect of this Chinese software powerhouse infiltrating all sorts of industries in cahoots with Russia is going to really put the sort of heebie-jeebies up there. And I think that all that's going to happen is we're going to end up with probably more restrictions even on Huawei in some way, that you can't use software from Huawei in Western markets and actually it might not even be restrictions. I just, this whole cloud thing is quite interesting because it ties in with this quite heavily. The fact that Huawei is making a big deal about how it's now a huge public cloud provider in China. But as a Western company, we talk about the cloud all the time on this podcast and how it's a bit worrying that there's only 3 big US firms that dominate the market outside China. But would any big sort of US corporation put its systems into a Huawei cloud, a Huawei sort of control cloud?
So that's yet another balkanization going on.
It's total balkanization.
And I'm sure, I don't know, I haven't really looked into it, but all this aggro that Chinese big tech has been getting from the Communist Party, I bet some of that's linked to them going, right, you're aligning with our strategic objectives, or you can... or you could spend some time on a gulag.
I think the software pivot, I mean, a lot of it's to do with the handset business itself, isn't it? Because one of the consequences, I guess, of the US sanctions was that they couldn't get the Android. They could get the skeleton of Android, I think, but they couldn't get all the sort of Google juice on top of that. So the apps that make Android so popular and so useful for users, the
and
the
the
Google
Play Store
stuff,
itself.
And the Play Store itself, they couldn't get. So what they've done, it sounds like, from reading between the lines, is they've come up with this forked version of Android they're calling Harmony OS, and then they've come out with some really big numbers. I think 2 million developers. They're saying it's the most third popular, even though it's not actually been released on smartphones. I think it's due out next week on smartphones.
There's been leaks about that.
And they're saying that it's got a couple of million developers. I mean, not that many outside China, it seems. So it's just going to become a sort of Chinese operating system,
totally.
I think.
I agree.
And now, the companies like Oppo and Vivo, and what's the other one, Xiaomi, which kind of use, I think, versions of Android where they've actually been able to cut out some of the Google stuff already. Maybe they'll be persuaded.
Yeah, well, I think the version of Android you get in China, I mean, like you can't get Facebook and Twitter and shit.
Yeah, so maybe they would be potential customers. If they might open it up to third parties, which I think they've said they want to do, they could be customers. Now, those are big sort of players in other markets, companies like Vivo. But you sort of worry about, what can I don't know, if there was a lot of momentum happening for a company like Vivo and Huawei software was underpinning that, you can kind of sense the US thinking, what do we do now to kind of disrupt this? And, you'll think about Xiaomi being a company that was on the entity list and then came off. That could always be revisited.
Totally.
And the trouble with Huawei is it doesn't really... Its big business, with that it makes $137 billion US from each year, is basically hardware reliant. They can't protect the smartphone business by developing software. The fact of the matter is there's 2 problems. They can't get Google stuff. The other bigger problem is they can't get chips that they need for those phones.
Yes.
And they're going to become less capable, less competitive, and then people just aren't going to buy them.
Yeah, I completely agree. On the Harmony OS side, it's possible to imagine that within China it would be a viable platform.
Yeah.
Because you can't get hold of half the apps that we can get hold of here anyway in China, because the Communist Party doesn't want people getting funny ideas. So yes, what you could have, even for other ones, you could have a situation where everyone is using Harmony in China, and those who have international operations, and presumably Huawei still does have plenty in, like Africa, for example, for its smartphone. Basically what I'm saying is I can't see Huawei with Harmony OS existing anywhere except within China.
Yeah, completely. And I think the other problem is their networks business, actually, as well, because obviously software gets used in the networks world as well. Now, they could pivot in the same way. They could say we're going to be a software player in networks, a bit like Mavenir, for instance, or Altiostar or Parallel Wireless, and try and be the company that develops the software that runs on top of hardware more. But then they're going to accept, for a start, that's a slightly sort of religious conversion for them, I think, just anyway, because they've not been they've not been enthusiasts about this whole concept of disaggregation in the radio access
what software
network.
Anyway?
And
are they going to be? They're not going to out Google on Android.
Well, that's for sure.
And what other areas of software are they going to? Are they going to out Oracle, or are they going to out Microsoft?
They could try and out Altiostar
right.
on the radio access network side, right? And maybe say, look, we can't get the competitive hardware that underpins the radio access network because for the same reason you can't get TSMC stuff that's 7 nanometer that you really need for
we'll kick ass and
so let's just become a Mavenir type software specialist, and we provide it on top of COTS equipment. Now, the trouble with that though is that they're not going to be a $137 billion company anymore. They're going to be a software player that makes up.
And that was the most flawed bit about it. And I thought it's so telling that the version of the memo we saw had clearly been toned down and doctored.
Yeah,
which makes me. Obviously, very.
It was a bloody weird memo, isn't it? Maybe something.
Well, it makes me very sceptical about any future leaked memos I get, and to what extent they've been dicked about with before they hit my inbox.
Anyway. there's all sorts of odd, weird language in it, like using the scalpel to kill the pigs, and it's almost like sort of Ernst Stavro Blofeld has met,
it is, but so
William Burroughs, and
the real negative about it is sort of twofold, but they're kind of the same point. So they've switched their rhetoric from we're just a good old, poor old honest Chinese company trying to make ends meet while the horrible Americans are being bullies.
Yeah,
which I have some sympathy for that narrative.
Yeah,
but as soon as they switch it to like, okay, you want to play it that way, do you, America? Well, we're going to take over the world, and you can't be part, and you can't play with our toys. Then that's a completely different narrative.
The other thing that's weird, though, as well, is this. The quote that you read from Reuters, this hour, and aligning themselves with China. They can't have it both ways. They're either independent. Western companies don't talk about themselves that way. They don't say we need to shut the they don't talk about themselves as part of America or part of the UK. It'd be very unusual to hear, AstraZeneca wouldn't talk about itself as a UK or Swiss sort of firm. It's just an international corporation that happens to have.
And it's just a little bit of phrasing, because if all that had been in the public domain was the version of the memo we saw, it wouldn't be such a big story at all.
Yeah.
It would just be like, okay, we'd still be talking about the viability of this strategic pivot to software and whether we think they can pull it off. That's still worth discussing. And I think we're both skeptical. But we wouldn't be talking about the fact that this pivot now... So you were talking about money. So now they seem to be... They don't really care about money. As long as we get to give America a taste of its own medicine, that seems to be the overwhelming priority, not a commercial one at all.
Yeah.
Just weird, isn't it?
It's weird. It's weird language, and they're quite sort of. It's not just this memo. Actually, they're quite sort of odd in some of the recent press conferences. I think the analyst summit and the annual results report, where they had people like Eric Xu on the call. It's all about, well, American companies will suffer more if we can't buy equipment from them, and it's all very much sort of setting it up as a geopolitical clash, but. By doing that, they're much better off, really, I think, from a PR perspective, talking up this line that we're an independent company and we're not owned by the Chinese state, and why can't you just let us get on with things? As soon as they start to sound quite antagonistic and use words like dominate, people start to think of them, oh, well, you're just basically a tool of Xi Jinping's then, aren't you? And it's all about advancing the Chinese government
It's such
interests.
A misstep. You're just like... I sort of had to do a double take. It's like, is this really... When I read the Reuters thing, because I read the version of the memo we're alluding to before I read the Reuters thing, I was like, oh, that's a very different tone in the Reuters thing.
And do you know what I think the consequence is a lot of the European governments actually that have looked at Huawei in the last sort of 2 years, 3 years and gone, well, hang on a minute. No, they're not controlled by the Chinese government. They're independent, and we can, as long as we put some security rules in place, it's all going to be okay. Well, as soon as this stuff comes out, policymakers are going to be sitting there thinking, well, hang on a minute, actually, do we really want this company anywhere near our networks? Especially while China's going around threatening Taiwan and being unpleasant in Hong Kong and doing all the other things that it's up to at the moment that aren't particularly
Xinjiang
nice.
And all that stuff.
Covering up lab leaks in Wuhan and
Yes. Yeah. Well, actually, I might come on to that briefly, if time will allow me, being self-indulgent. So I'll just say, sort of draw a line under that, and to agree with what you were just saying. In my concluding paragraph, I said, "What does Huawei hope to achieve by leaking stuff like this to the international media? Surely it will merely stiffen the resolve of those countries already ill-disposed towards Huawei, and is likely to offend others it appears to take for granted." Because that was the other thing. This dominate and our stuff. If I was Africa, I'd be like, well, hold on a sec, Huawei. Well, so we're just we're just a pawn for you to, it's very presumptuous.
Yeah, the dominate Europe is not going to make any.
No.
I mean, the European political
And
leaders
Asia
who read Reuters undoubtedly, because it's quite well read apparently, Reuters, who are reading that story, are going to be thinking, what the hell?
Yeah.
They're talking about dominating us all of a sudden.
Well, once we dominate Europe, the Asia Pacific and Africa, I mean, part of Asia Pacific is Australia, Japan, South Korea, lots of other places that aren't going to buy into all this.
No,
it's just bizarre. And so that was a misstep, and they probably know it.
Yeah.
It reminded me a little bit of a story I just wrote before we left, which I'll talk about very quickly. But Amazon's come up with this thing called Amazon, which is a little cubicle in its warehouses where people can go in, and it supposedly helps them with their mental health. And it seems to be, without, to sort of steel man their position. If they're concerned about their employees' mental health, then good. And if they're doing something about it, then good.
Yeah.
Obviously, the question of why mental health is suddenly such a big deal is an interesting one.
Yeah.
I never get anyone asking me about my fucking mental health, despite there being plenty of evidence that it's something that should be looked into. But yes, this little cubicle, which apparently then just plays soothing music and goes, "It's all right, don't worry about it," or whatever they say.
Yeah.
It got a lot of coverage on social media and the general media. Someone called it like a despair cubicle or something like that. And basically, it obviously backfired such that by the time I got to look at it, the tweet that had a little video talking about it had been taken down. The press release that was apparently linked to in that tweet had been taken down. And it's just an example. It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
It's just an example of another misstep. We think these big companies have just got every base covered. They've got expert sort of flaks and spin doctors and stuff in-house. But every now and then they just drop the ball. So, and I think that's what Huawei did. Okay. So, moving on. Censorship. Let me just fire up some of my censorship stories. Basically, the biggest one from this censorship narrative for me was Facebook yesterday. They issued a press release saying that they're going to crack down on people who consistently share misinformation. And so you get these two slightly interchangeable terms coming up when people are talking about censorship these days: misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah.
And by the dictionary definition, misinformation is just stuff that's wrong, that's inaccurate. Disinformation has a degree of motive and malevolence built into it. And so the most extreme example of disinformation are things we know. There's like these bot farms in Russia, and there's these, Iran, and basically people who want to muck about with the open West will actually invest state resources into trying to mess with people's heads. And I think that has to be looked at. As someone who's quite a free speech absolutist, I'm not a total absolutist. There are certain things, there's the cliche about shouting fire in a crowded theatre. There are certain things that can demonstrably prove harm or be illegal, like me going on social media going, here's Ian Morris, here's his address, go around and chuck bricks through his window. You obviously should have some protection from me just calling for actual violence against you.
Yeah.
But other than that, I think it should just be fair game. Certainly being offended shouldn't be grounds for censorship. And so they've gone, their post was taking action against people who repeatedly share misinformation. And basically they're talking about shadow banning. Have you heard
This
the term?
is Facebook?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you heard the term shadow banning?
No.
It's basically when they don't say you're banned, but no one can see your shit anyway.
Right.
So they're making shadow banning official.
Unless you specifically
search for you're posting stuff.
Yeah, there's degrees of shadow banning, but it's basically a way of downranking your social media presence.
Right.
such that, sometimes people even, like on Twitter, if they follow you, won't see stuff.
Well, I'm interested in, can they do this on their search engine as well? So content, news stories that that don't suit their angle can be sort of end up on page 10 or whatever.
Well, there was some things like that would not show up on Google about the vaccines and stuff that would show up on
Yes, I remember even the Great Barrington Declaration, which actually wasn't that controversial at all, really, I thought.
No, and yet they thought it was.
DuckDuckGo, it would show up.
Yeah.
Exactly, and there's a quote from the Facebook thing that says, "Starting today, we will reduce the distribution of all posts in newsfeed," which is basically what you see.
Yeah.
From an individual's Facebook account if they repeatedly share content that has been rated by one of our fact-checking partners. So basically, if they're fact-checkers, and I'll get onto that in a sec, if their fact-checkers say that you're talking shit, they will now basically, what's the way they put it? Reduce the distribution of all posts.
Right.
So, we follow each other on Facebook. We quite often put up sort of dissenting stuff against the pandemic best practice narrative.
Yeah.
We're not fans of the lockdown. We're not fans of masks, all that sort of thing. And it could be that we just see each other's stuff less often, and everyone sees our stuff less often because they would have decided that.
Yeah.
And and the fact checking stuff is just remarkable. There's one fact checker. I had quite a lot of hyperlinks in this story called Full Fact, and most of its funding comes from Facebook. Whereas the whole way in which these fact checkers are positioned is these completely objective, independent.
So I didn't know that at all, because Full Fact I've seen used quite a lot to sort of investigate UK political stories.
Yep.
And it gets referenced by the newspapers even. Full Fact did a kind of a survey on this, or an investigation rather on this, and found these are the results. But I didn't know Facebook was the company behind it mainly.
So, I mean, you're not going to be able to see it, but this is the thing I linked to. It says in their 2020 funding, they've got about 500,000 off Facebook, and they're by far the biggest donor. Google's in there as well.
Right.
So there's that. There's also the fact that they're just discredited because they're fallible.
Yeah.
To err is human, and they're going to get things wrong. And a classic example, to indulge a bit of a coronavirus tangent, has been this lab leak hypothesis that we're both reading about. The leader in Spectator, written by Matt Ridley, is talking about that. Back a year ago, so there were two hypotheses about how this coronavirus suddenly cropped up. One is that people got it from hanging out with bats or whatever in wet markets.
Yeah.
And the other was that it leaked from this lab that happened to be in Wuhan, which we know is ground zero for the bug.
Yeah. Which happens to do investigations of bats and
happens to do investigations of bats, and happens to do like gain of function research where they try and manipulate viruses to make them more deadly.
Yeah,
I told you this a few weeks ago. I was like, how many wet markets do you think there are in China?
Yeah, exactly.
And how many labs like that?
Yeah.
What are the
and also the Wuhan market apparently doesn't even sell pangolins or bats. Apparently,
no.
So
you got to go down the road. for them.
Just from a pure mathematical odds.
Yeah, exactly. What is the likelihood?
Yeah,
and yet for most of last year, if you tried to say, well, maybe it's because of this lab, not only would the consensus be that you're a conspiracy theorist and you're a dick, and anyway, Trump said it, and anything Trump says must by definition be wrong.
It could be just a human error. I'm not saying they did it on purpose.
No, I think it was a leak. I don't think anybody's at this stage is suggesting that they actually released it, because that's silly. Why would it be in their own interest to do that?
Some new guy didn't follow protocol and made a mistake.
I mean, I suppose there's one argument that they thought they could get over it more quickly and it would screw up the West, but I think that's a bit far-fetched, to be honest.
Well, you're getting into real sort of cat stroking, Bond villain territory there, but it's not inconceivable.
It's not inconceivable, but I think that the lab leak, to me, I've read a few Spectator pieces on this, because they had an excellent one I thought a few months ago, written by a fiction author, who was saying, if you were setting out a plot and you looked at these two theories, the one that seems far more plausible is the lab leak rather than the wet market one, and just wrote this amazing piece that made you think, well, actually, the wet market is actually a ridiculous notion.
Well, and zoonotic transmission, which is the term, zoonotic is when you get something transmitted from animals to humans.
Yeah.
It's quite rare.
It's very rare, yeah.
And in the case of SARS, as this piece says, the previous SARS, they tracked it down to some cat within a couple of weeks. We've had 18 months of the biggest thing in a century.
Yeah.
And apparently the pangolin thing is a dead end.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's taken seriously enough now that Biden's launched, a new inquiry.
Well, so this is
like 2 days ago.
Yeah.
So this is the point. So Facebook used to actively censor
if you put up a thing going coronavirus came from a lab, Facebook would actively censor it.
Yeah.
And now with Biden coming out with this statement going, yeah, it might have been that, or whatever equivalent Biden-y way he said it. He's a lot more coherent in writing than in person.
It might have been that.
Yeah. Am I allowed to say that? What's going on? Is it tea time yet? Now suddenly Facebook is having to unban all this stuff. And so not only is this a humiliating U-turn by Facebook and a lot of mainstream media, I might add, but it, as far as I'm concerned, definitively makes it clear that there's bias and political censorship on Facebook. How come it was banned when Trump said it and unbanned when Biden said it?
And China will never admit it because it makes them look incapable, even if it's an accidental.
Well, I mean, this is going to be.
Well, I mean, it would result in there'd be a huge fallout if
massive.
they were,
It'd be like
they were
the story
seen to
of
have
the
engineered
decade.
something that then got out of a lab, even accidentally. It would be huge. I mean, there'd be. It's a massive bust up then between them and the West. Clearly, it's much worse than it. Okay, it happened in a wet market, but it wasn't really our fault.
Well, exactly.
We have wet markets,
and yet everything they're doing. Back to bad communications again. We had this press event, I think, in February, where they got these people supposedly from the World Health Organization to come to China, and they took them around all the facility, and they'd obviously
they're a waste of time, aren't they? The WHO, to be quite
well,
frank.
they are, but that was the best we had at the time, and the place was obviously gleaming.
Yeah.
But they handpicked the WHO people that went there. They didn't really let them look into anything. They just made them sit in front of some PowerPoint.
In quarantine for 10 days.
Yeah, they made them all that. And then the WHO people came out and went, yeah, no, everything looked cool. And
it smelled like bleach everywhere.
Yeah, it smelled like bleach. Funnily enough, there wasn't anything there at all. There wasn't even any fucking furniture. And no one bought it.
Yeah.
So this is another example of trying to be too cute. You know, back to like we were talking about with Huawei, back to what we were talking about with Amazon, trying to be too cute with your sort of public communications and it backfiring. Because everyone was like, hold on a minute.
The thing is that, it might be so we don't get like World War III. It might be in the best interest of everyone if it's never found out that it was more than just wet market stuff.
Maybe that's one way of looking at it. But I'm pretty pissed off at the inconvenience and cost that this thing has inflicted on the world over the last 18 months.
And also,
I don't want it to happen again.
Yeah, exactly. There's always we need to know the truth.
I'm just saying,
because we don't want the same thing happening again.
But it could be a way where the CIA or agencies like find out what it was for real, but then it's never made fully public. I don't know.
Maybe, but it's all kind of unraveling now, and it could be that there's just such overwhelming public demand for some hard answers.
Yeah.
And that's the only reason I can imagine why the Biden administration suddenly making public positions on it is they know one thing politicians can do, even those as confused as Biden, it's their job to sense public mood. That's their job, basically, and they're good at it. And they could probably sense that there could be a strategic thing. It could be that the Biden administration decided to get tough with China, and this is a handy way of embarrassing them and putting them in an awkward situation or whatever. I don't really care about that. I just think we can all agree it'd be nice to know, so it doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
And what seems most likely at this stage is that they were mucking around with viruses in order to create vaccines, in order to anticipate the next big pandemic, and they actually ended up creating it.
Yeah,
but I don't think what do you mean? So it doesn't happen again. Like, let's say, oh yeah, it was a lab leak. Like, what are they going to say? Like, change your protocols and
exactly.
Well,
that sort
probably
of thing.
are.
Because don't forget, there was American involvement in this lab as well. It wasn't just a closed Chinese.
But
thing.
even without finding out, they probably definitely reviewed everything in there. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. If someone somewhere is dicking about with viruses and making the next COVID.
Yeah.
How much can we do about it? One thing, actually, back to the more Bond villains conspiracy theories. I just noticed that there's been a big spike in India, which borders China, and China doesn't like.
Yeah.
More recently, there's a big spike in Taiwan, which borders China, and China doesn't like.
I'm trying to provide vaccines to Taiwan.
And I'm not saying it could be coincidence. It could be that the fact that Taiwan's tried to go for this zero COVID thing, which I think stupid, because all you're doing is kicking the can down the road. Sooner or later, unless you vaccinate
there's
everyone.
There's a spike in Australia, isn't there, at the moment as well?
Right. Well, they've been trying that, and they they're in the Chinese part of the world as much as they're in any part of the world.
Yeah. China really needs those Taiwanese chips, though.
And China doesn't like them. Yeah, but I'm just saying, how many more Asia Pacific countries that are hostile to China, such as Japan or South Korea, have to get a spike before you start wondering whether they're sending lads in with vials of this stuff and then just lobbing it in the river? Anyway, obviously I've got no evidence for that. I'm just saying, if it keeps happening, it becomes more plausible that there's some dastardly deeds afoot. So back to the Facebook thing. It's the real thing I had the problem with is, at the same time as them having to concede that they have been inaccurately and unfairly censoring, they double down on censorship and say they're going to shadow ban anyone who says anything that their discredited fact checkers disagree with.
Yeah.
So it's just a complete mess. And at the same time, you've got India raiding Twitter's offices because Twitter's not censoring to the satisfaction of the Indian government. You've got people getting menaced in Russia for the same reason. You've got a few others I can't remember off the top of my head that I covered, where there's a hell of a lot of pressure on social media companies to censor more in certain parts of the world that have more authoritarian governments. And at the same time, they're voluntarily looking to censor more in the West. And it's just my bugbear. I just think don't censor.
It's a huge shit show.
It's a huge shit show, and I just think don't censor. Obviously, you have to censor if the law says it.
Yeah.
If Boris Johnson comes out tomorrow and says, "Well, we'll have less of that,"
well, they've become.
Then you got to do it.
I mean, what are they? I suppose we get pissed off about this because they're platforms that everybody uses, and that even though they're privately owned, they've become something more than that. They've actually become a public square for everybody to have a say. But they're behaving and being treated by countries like, because we've had press censorship going on in Russia and Turkey and countries like that for decades,
and we're all outraged at that.
And we don't like it, but we know that it happens with newspapers. And they're actually behaving themselves like newspapers. We pick and choose what content's going to go in. We're going to pick which letters go in.
And yet they're protected by Section 230.
But they're protected by regulations that say they're not newspapers. So they can't have it both ways.
It's clearly bullshit. It's got to come to a head sooner or later, but it's probably be later. I just think it's just yet another example that censorship doesn't work. It's always going to be selective.
Yeah.
All you can do, it's a cliche. They say the best antidote to bad speech is good speech. If someone says something out of order, someone says something offensive, someone says something bigoted, someone says something contentious, if you've got an Alex Jones type saying the CIA is trying to turn the frogs gay or whatever his thing is, you don't censor him. You just go, Alex, CIA's not doing that, mate.
Yeah.
Where's your evidence?
Yeah.
You're just talking shit, son.
And then the worst case, even than that, is just censoring things that turn out possibly to be right, as with the COVID sort of lab leak.
Well, and that's why censorship is particularly bad. Not only is it futile, but it's actively malevolent.
Yeah.
And it's authoritarian. It's despotic.
It's groupthink, sort of, in a weird way, isn't it? It's almost like this. There's a parallel here with the reaction to COVID generally, I think. I mean, you just mentioned masks earlier, but the fact that everybody goes around wearing masks, and in some countries they all go around wearing masks outside, then it's total bollocks. There's no proof at all that
you can get censored for saying that.
But to suggest that you shouldn't do it. Now, what will probably happen in a year's time, some of these countries will go, actually evidence shows it's more harmful to wear them outside because you're more likely to handle them badly and put your fingers in your mouth
or something like that.
It's just generally unhealthy anyway. And then all of a sudden people won't want to wear them. And a lot of stories that got banned and deprioritised, if you like, will end up having to be reinstated. So it's just a dodgy game to play, I think.
And ultimately, who is anyone to decide what is true and what isn't?
Exactly, yeah.
Truth, science, in this time of follow the science, the scientific method is very misunderstood. The whole point of the scientific method is to question everything.
Yep.
That's why everything remains a hypothesis or a theory. The science isn't about absolutes. It's definitively not. It's about trying to get to some degree of truth in terms of the thing you're studying. But you do it by questioning everything and by peer review and by stress testing and all this sort of stuff. And the attitude to ideas right now is that the man knows what's right and everyone else has got to not only believe it, but not be publicly dissenting about it. It's appalling. Anyway, we better move that on, and that's not really telecoms-y, but it's something that
interesting
I like to
topic.
rant about.
Yeah.
So we'll move it back onto something more telecoms-y, which is, I'll hand it straight over to you because you've written about it and I haven't, which is this sort of latest on OpenRAN.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a totally new thing because I think we know for a while now that certain governments and countries have. I mean, OpenRAN's become really political, yeah. I think didn't start out that way. Started out as a kind of nifty technology that would lower costs and make things a bit more flexible in the RAN in terms of using suppliers, and it's become very politicized, partly because of Huawei. A lot of countries have sort of seen it as a if we're going to ban Huawei and we've only got 2 other big vendors, then we need something else. And OpenRAN's a way to do that because it allows people to specialize, and you couldn't create a Nokia from scratch and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think the danger is that this gets into this whole. I mean, the UK government at the moment. One thing I don't particularly like about them is that they're incredibly interventionist in a way that we haven't seen under most conservative governments, I would say, and probably haven't seen under most governments since the 1970s. This sort of picking winners mentality. Things that happened in the UK in the 70s, like British Leyland, which was a kind of automotive merger that just went wrong, that was kind of engineered by the state.
Dog turds of cars.
And it's not quite got to that stage with telecom, but I think there's some worrying developments, and particularly with OpenRAN. I think to hear Oliver Dowden, the Minister of whatever it is, Minister of Fun, I think should be his job title.
Yeah,
but
he's
in charge of all this
area.
stuff. Calling out
digital minister.
Yeah,
I think
but specifically calling out OpenRAN, and we've had this telecom task force set up that came out with this very worrying report, I thought, a few weeks ago, where they were sort of recommending that operators have 25% of their networks based on OpenRAN by the mid-2020s. Effectively telling privately owned companies what suppliers they should be using, and Ofcom has. And the reason it's kind of a newsy story is because they've been liaising with other regulators around the world. It emerges they don't feel that on their own they have sufficient clout to shape the market, essentially. And there was a guy on a call with BEREC, which is like a club of European regulators, from Ofcom this week, saying we're only probably about 2% of telco vendor revenues worldwide. So we sort of need to team up with other authorities to try and make things
we need a leg
move
up
it in the right direction. And they'd sent this paper to the Federal Communications Commission that I came across because one of my colleagues sent it to me. Going on about that. I mean, this was already known. This Sonic Labs Centre they're setting up, which features a number of private sector vendors, people like Mavenir and Acceleran, which is a Belgian firm involved in OpenRAN, and a few others.
But you will get some startups cropping up.
There'll be some startups there.
The amount of state wedge that's flying around.
It's basically a sort of testing and R&D development lab. And you just sort of think, to me, this isn't what Ofcom should be doing, and it's part Ofcom and it's part this agency called Digital Catapult, I think, that is sort of administering it. But
there's all this sort of incubation stuff.
Yeah.
But it is picking winners, as you say.
Well, why is there a need for that from a regulator? We've already got, Mavenir's just opened a test lab. Vodafone, we both wrote about it, has opened a test lab. NEC has picked the UK to be its global OpenRAN centre of excellence. You've got Nokia now saying it's developing a company that makes 22 billion a year in sales, euros, saying it's going to develop OpenRAN products.
Rakuten with NEC and Fujitsu making a whole platform for everyone.
If the market if there's enough demand for OpenRAN products, then OpenRAN products will appear. It is not up to a regulator to get involved in that area and say, this is what we're doing. A regulator should be making the rules, making sure that there aren't dominant players, looking at things like interconnection charges and wholesale rates.
Yes.
They shouldn't be steering the development of a particular technology.
Totally. And we've had this thing in the UK, this guy who used to be Boris Johnson's right-hand man called Dominic Cummings, going and giving evidence about how the start of the pandemic was handled. And, he has an axe to grind because he was sacked. But, allowing for any sort of vindictiveness in what he's saying, if we think that there's some truth to it, it does paint a picture of just fucking cluelessness.
Yeah.
And and that's fine. I'm not saying I would have done better, but this is another reason why. Back to what I was saying about censorship, you just don't concentrate power too much in one place, because people are flawed. People are flawed intrinsically. They have incomplete information. They have external pressures that lead them to make bad decisions. There's just all sorts of of mitigation and obstacles in the way of taking the best course of action.
Yep.
So the best thing to have is to not have too much power concentrated in one place, to have things as open and transparent as possible, to have other stakeholders getting involved. I understand that when you've got something like the start of the pandemic happening, you can't just put it to the wider country and say, what do you reckon we should do? Because by the time the consensus has emerged, it'd be too late. But it turns out it's too late when they acted anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm deeply sceptical about Cummings' assertion, incidentally, going back onto the coronavirus, that if we'd locked down harder and earlier, it would have helped, because it's still just kicking the can down the road. Unless we'd locked down the whole country absolutely for a full year, i.e. until these vaccines started coming along, then as soon as we opened up, we would have had what's happening to Taiwan or whatever right now.
Yeah,
anyway,
completely.
So back to your point. This is another reason why having a regulator picking winners is bullshit. Not only is it not its place, but there's absolutely no precedent or evidence or anecdote to make you think it's going to do a good job of it.
No, in fact, the merest suggestion that public sector gets involved in picking, a particular technology that should succeed, it's just terrifying, really.
Yeah.
I mean, whenever things like that have been attempted, it generally hasn't gone
you look
well.
At things like the NHS IT project,
exactly,
cost about
exactly.
$1 zillion,
and this is still a really early stage technology that's quite controversial. There's lots of problems there that need to be fixed to do with systems integration challenges, to do with security, to do with energy efficiency, all these issues. But it's not for the regulator to do that. That's a market thing to be done. And the market is already working on stuff like that. I don't see why Ofcom should be getting involved and basically providing a facility, it seems, that's been built, I'm guessing, with public sector money, because it's Ofcom and it's digital, it's public sector authorities that are doing it, for a lot of private sector companies to come in. And the guy on the Berwick call even said, because they don't have the R&D scale at the moment. Well, that isn't for the public sector to do. They're not even UK companies. There's not a single UK company that was named in the FCC document. So there's not even a protectionist side to this. It's just picking a technology that they've decided they want to promote. And I don't want to sound negative about OpenRAN, which I'm conscious that I possibly do a lot in my coverage and when I talk about it, because great, if it works out and everybody wants it and it overcomes these difficulties, then why not? And if it diversifies the market, but that's not what a regulator should be doing. That's for the market to decide and for the market to work out the solutions to the problems. And I mean, and there's been a plea from, I know it's self-interest to some extent, because Nokia and Ericsson, no matter how much they say they're engineering things for OpenRAN and they're moving that direction, they obviously have a potential challenge with this technology coming along. It could threaten them. But they've both themselves sort of said they don't think it's a good idea for governments to be mandating particular technologies. There's lots of operators you talk to who don't like the idea of things being disaggregated that way. They actually want integrated products.
And as you say, let the market decide.
Let the market decide, yeah. Now, I know it's difficult with the competition side of things to get other people into the mix, but again, that's not something things will work themselves out, because that's what happens.
It's like we've always said, if it's a good technology, then operators will buy it and it will grow.
Yeah.
If it's shit, they won't.
Totally.
I don't care how many governments and regulators poke
but
their nose in.
it's not just the UK. I mean, I've singled it out with the UK because of this Ofcom story, but obviously the FCC's all over this as well.
Yeah.
And
I think that's the origin
even
of it.
more politicised in the
Well, I
US.
think that's the. I can imagine the cascade of pressure coming from the US government to the UK government, and then the UK government goes, chaps, will you chuck a few quid at this, please?
Yep.
And I think it's all political.
Yeah.
And, the UK has always had a rich track record of trying to suck up to the American government. If you look at things like Iraq with Tony Blair, Yo Blair, and all that sort of thing. We were their biggest cheerleaders, and I think in subsequent memoirs it's become clear that Tony Blair thought this is a chance for us to get even closer to America by being their one international ally in this what turned out to be bullshit endeavour that they went off and we contributed to the whole WMD lie and all that stuff. And so we've got a rich history there, and this is obviously nothing on that scale, but I can imagine Americans going, we want to see you guys being really proactive about this shit, and us just going, yeah, well, it's especially after Brexit, we want to stay in America's good books, which I agree with geopolitically.
Yeah.
But there's a limit.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we just don't. I think we've said this before. What was the point of having Brexit if we're then just going to do what America says instead of what Europe says the whole time?
Yeah.
Anyway, yes, I think. In terms of our position, you were going. I sometimes sounded a little bit negative. I think I'll speak for both of us, but you can tell me if I'm not speaking for you. Our position is always of healthy skepticism.
Yeah.
Like we are with public cloud. So there's an example of the private sector at work. Daniel Royston got hold of hundreds of millions of dollars, apparently.
Yeah.
She's chucking it around.
Yeah.
I would love to. I know she's good at tennis. I know she's good at evangelizing, but she's bloody good at raising money. I'll give her that.
Yeah.
But that's the market at work.
Yeah.
Via someone, why can't there be a Daniel Royston of OpenRAN?
Mm-hmm.
That's
why can't the operators themselves? They talk a good game about OpenRAN, but the only one that's made an actual firm commitment in terms of this is how many sites we're going to build in a Western market, as far as I'm aware, is Vodafone in the UK. All these other operators that are clubbing together and signing these memos saying regulators, please support OpenRAN. Well, hang on a minute. That's not their job. You're the ones who need to say to the suppliers, if you do it, we will build this amount of stuff. And they all have their own VC funds these days. Orange, Deutsche Telekom. I don't see any of them investing in OpenRAN companies.
No, and we know that Vodafone is talking a good game about it. But again, we'll wrap it up in a minute. Again, you want to see more than just talking a good game sometimes. Yeah. Just to finish off on the subject of journalistic skepticism, which is something a lot of the journalistic world seems to have forgotten. You're getting a lot of activist journalists, you're getting a lot of biased journalism, you're getting a lot of editorializing within news reports.
Yeah.
I think it's the journalist's job to question everything.
Yeah.
Okay, not to a dickish extent. If there's overwhelming evidence that says this is a good thing, there's got to come a time where a journalist goes, fair enough, we're going to move on to the next thing. But it's our job to say, is this mania for open cloud, public cloud, a completely unreserved positive with nothing bad about it? It's our job to ask that question. It's our job to ask the question whether the government should be picking winners in OpenRAN and all that sort of thing. And so I don't think we should ever, and I'm sure you don't, we should never feel self-conscious about appearing negative, because what we're being is sceptical and asking questions, and that's our job.
Yep.
And anyone who thinks that's not a journalist's job, I'd like to have a chat with them about what they think is. Cool. Well, talking about doing your job, you've got to go and do it and interview.
I do.
Interview some Californian in 5 minutes. So we'll wrap it up there. Thanks a lot for watching. Make sure you join us for the next one.